So far in this semester, we've been working with setups that don't really have much space in them. I'm giving you photographs of still lifes that only have a foot or so of depth in it. So we need to start talking about how to create the illusion of real depth in our drawings. And by space, it should be obvious. I mean 1, 2, and 3 dimensions. We're working in a 3-dimensional world. The first thing we need to look at are depth cues. These are just some very simple cues that give us information, gives our visual system information about the arrangements of objects in space. You can see here's a couple of photos I took at Knight's Ferry. I stepped over like one step to take this photograph. But you'll see that with the change in lighting out here, the image really opens up and there's a better sense of depth to it. So we're going to look at some of the types of things that you can do to create that. And then I'm going to talk about linear perspective, which is really what we'll be spending the next few assignments on. The basic depth cues are all really simple and they're based on just experience walking around day-to-day life. They should be pretty obvious once I point them out. So overlap, this is just the assumption that an object, an opaque object, something that's not see-through, will cover up a thing that is behind it. When we compress down to 2 dimensions and we're just using line, it gets a little bit vague. So the easy assumption here is that this is either like 3 basketballs, one behind the other, or there's like 3 discs, one on top of the other. Our brains are more likely to interpret this image that way because we're going to interpret things as the most obvious. Remember, our brains don't like unanswered questions. And when we're trying to pull meaning and pattern out of the world in front of us, we're going to go with the easiest assumption. So the easiest assumption is that there's these 3 spheres or 3 circles behind each other. But there is some ambiguity because it could just be 3 shapes like this, like a ball and 2 weird Pac-Man shapes, and the Pac-Man shapes are just like chewing on the ball and chewing on each other. It's unlikely we're going to see that, but it is a possible misinterpretation of a drawing like that. Also, if you have like color or value involved, you could have an image like this where the shapes are overlapping in some sense and one moving from the front into behind something. Or if an object looks see-through in part, it will create a sense of overlap depending on where the object is. Something else that we're just really used to seeing in day-to-day life, and which is going to be really essential to what we're going to talk about at the end of this lecture with linear perspective, is diminution of size. This is just the experience that we're used to of as things get farther away from us, they appear to get smaller in our visual field, and thus they'd show up smaller on the picture plane. So with 3 circles like this, I could interpret it as 3 basketballs getting further away from me. Again, there's some ambiguity. It could also just represent like a basketball, a softball, and a golf ball all like right next to each other, hung on a string. But it's pretty easy to make an assumption of it being like this. The third and least obvious of the standard depth cues is vertical placement. This is going to be very important to us. We dealt with it a little bit when we were dealing with cross contour. This is the idea that we have our eye level, and anything that is below our eye level is going to get further down in the picture plane as it gets closer to us. Anything that is above our eye level will get closer to the top of the picture plane as it gets closer to us. And you can confirm this just by looking out into your room in front of you, like the back of whatever table or bed that you're looking at would be higher up in the picture plane, and the part that's closer to you would be lower, and then the lights or whatever is on the ceiling, anything that's further away would be lower down, and anything closer would be higher up. So, it'd be something like this where we could see pool balls on a pool table with the ones further down being closer. Now again, there's ambiguity. If we just have 3 circles, there's no reason why we have to see it as 3 spheres. We could just see it as 3 circular objects on a table at different placements. So what we really want to do is combine all 3 of them. This combination that we should aim for whenever possible is going to create a much more convincing illusion of like 3 spheres coming towards us, because we have overlap, diminution of size, and the vertical placement coming down. So it's like we're low down looking at this. This is much easier to interpret as this, much more difficult to interpret as like these three bubble shapes all stuck onto each other when we see this as line. When you disrupt these depth cues and you leave like only one left over, you get this trick called force perspective. This takes advantage of the lack of overlap, and because of the lack of overlap, you're also disrupting the sense of vertical placement, and then you're creating ambiguity about the diminution of the size. You're creating ambiguity about what size something actually is. So in this image, the girl up front has placed her hand such that it does not overlap with the foot behind. It looks like the foot's standing on the hand. That messes with vertical placement and takes the foot to where it no longer seems like it's on the road, but it seems like it's on the hand. So we get rid of the vertical placement cue as well. And then we just make the assumption that, well, this is a small person standing on a large person's hand, or a regular sized person holding like a little Thumbelina or Tinkerbell. If you took the hand away, we would at least have vertical placement, even though there's no overlap, and we would go, oh yeah, well, obviously that's just someone further in the background. If you're very careful about how you use these, you can get one of these to work and make sense. So like in these old 8-bit RPG games like Legend of Zelda, all they're using is vertical placement. If you walk down the screen, it feels like you're moving towards. If you go up the screen, it feels like you're moving backwards. There's no overlap. We're to understand that the trees are right against the wall, but here the wall doesn't overlap them all. It actually looks like they're growing out of the side of the wall. And there's no change in size. Things remain the same size as they go back. And there's not even differences in size. The chair is as big as a tree, is as big as a person. So the perspectives, really, the space and size is all screwed up here. But they were clever about how they use this sense of vertical placement, and that still reinforces motion forward and backwards. The other depth cue that we have is called atmospheric or aerial perspective. This creates the illusion of distance by reducing color warmth and saturation. So that just means like reds, oranges, warm greens like this are more likely to come forward, and blues and purples are more likely to go backwards. We don't have color available to us in class, but that's fine. Because value contrast, so darker darks and brighter brights up front, and then more towards the mid grays and back. And then clarity of detail. And this will imply atmosphere between the viewer and distant objects. It's like putting a fog into the image. We're all used to seeing this here in the Central Valley. We have plenty of fog. We have terrible pollen days. We have fires lighting off all around us. So we're used to seeing foggy air that blocks off things in the distance. But even on a nice day, like blue wavelengths of light travel further than red wavelengths of light, so things will look bluer even on a crystal clear day in the background. Our eyes suck, and over a distance we'll lose detail. And then no matter how clear the air is, there's particulate matter in the air, and it will create the illusion. So you see all of these things going on in this painting, Morning in the Tropics by Frederick Edwin Church. Up close you have warmer colors, so the greens are warmer. There's really dark darks, really bright brights. All the detail is there. As you move back, the saturation goes down. The color gets a little bit more gray and a little bit colder. The value contrast goes way down. There's none of the dark darks anymore. And the detail goes down because we can't see detail at that distance. As we go back, it gets even cooler and bluer and grayer. Again, it moves towards less and less value contrast and less detail, and so on, back into the back where we can barely see anything. So even when we're drawing like a still life that's really close to us, we can use this idea of a foggier looking background. We can lie a little bit and have the image seem like it has more depth by having things be a little bit out of focus, a little bit foggy, a little bit less value contrast back there. It's a very powerful depth cue. If you're working especially with photorealism, that idea of blur can also lend to a sense of focal length or focal depth. So you'll see an image like this. It's like if I blur out the foreground and focus on the background, that creates a sense of depth. And then if I reverse that and have a nice crisp background and a blurry background, that will also create a sense of depth. We're used to seeing that in movies. We're used to seeing that in photographs. And then we're used to our eyes doing that as well. our eyes, remember, can move through space. They're like three-dimensional. We move side to side, up and down, but focus allows us to move back and forth through space. So that change in focus can be a depth cue as well. What we're really going to spend the next few assignments on, though, is linear perspective. Linear perspective uses the diminution of size, and it applies that to parallel lines to get a mathematical system. Don't worry, we're not going to have to do any numbers. It's just visual geometry with straight lines. So what's going on is, if we look at an image like this, where we've just got two parallel, like the road, imagine as two perfectly parallel lines, and imagine they went around the whole world. If we stay between those lines and saw them from the top, they would never touch. They would just go around the world and never touch. That's what parallel lines means. But because we're in perspective, we see them from our perspective down in it. We see the edges seem to get closer and closer and closer as they go backwards, because the size of the width between them diminishes. It gets smaller as it goes back, as things do. Same with the telephone poles, right? The top and bottom of the telephone poles are pretty much all lined up on a horizontal line, and so each telephone pole seems to get smaller as it goes back, and also the distance between them seems to get smaller as it goes back. This apparent shrinking happens at an even and predictable rate, and that leads all of the lines colliding to one point on the horizon line. So we should all know the horizon line is where the sky splits, the earth and the sky split, and all of those lines will shrink until they come to one point here. That's the basics of perspective. Here's some definitions. First off, we need the picture plane. We have to throw a window up in front of us, in front of reality, for all of this to work. Then the horizon line is just where your eye level's at in relationship to the picture plane. You could get way up in the air in an airplane and your eye would still be on the horizon line. You could get way down onto the ground and it would still be there. You can also I could shift the picture plane down. So say this represents 6 feet tall. My eyes are at 6 feet tall. I could move the border of the picture plane down, or I could shift it up so that the bottom's closer to 6 feet tall. So these things can move in relationship to each other. I could leave the picture plane stable, and I can move the horizon line up, which would mean, now I'm up at 8 feet tall, now I'm down at 3 feet tall. Or I could just move the picture plane around the horizon. Either way. You can't get away from the horizon line. The only thing you can do is look up or down, but it will still be out there where you would be looking if you brought your eyes back straight forward. And, don't listen to rappers like B.O.B. who they went up in an airplane and the earth still looked straight and their eyes were still on the horizon line, so it must be flat. No, it's just a really big, really, really big ball, and so it still looks straight. The only way to get your eye line legitimately off the horizon line is to get into outer space where the earth turns into a little ball. Where you're looking at on the horizon, like wherever it is that you're staring straight towards, that's called the central vanishing point. That's just straight out in front of wherever you're looking, that's where it's going to be. Again, it could be over here. You could, if you had a window in front of you, you could be standing off to the side of the window, or you could stand still and scooch the window to the side and move the central vanishing point in relationship to the picture plane. But in relationship to your line of sight, it's always going to be directly in front of you. So what we're looking at is 1 point perspective. When we're looking at boxes, which we have here, boxes have planes. This is the flat parts. They have edges and they have corners. In 1 point perspective, you have one plane facing you, so you have a facing plane, and that means that you'll get an up and down, a vertical, and a side to side edge, and then you'll have one edge that's receding, and that edge always connects to the vanishing point. And by receding, I just mean moving backwards and forwards towards you and away from you. So you see this is going backwards and forwards throughout the space. These just go side to side and up and down. So in 1 point perspective, you always have side to side, up and down, and then one edge moving away from you towards the central vanishing point. You can get images like this where artists are creating imaginary worlds entirely using this system. So it's a very powerful tool once you learn how to use perspective. Here you'll see that the person is high up. So the horizon line represents, 60, 70 feet in the air, it's also high up in relationship to the picture plane. It could still represent 60 feet in the air, but be down here in relationship to the picture plane. So it represents them being high up. It's high up in relation to the picture plane, and it's pretty far off to the right. And then to get the buildings, they're either drawing verticals, horizontals, or if the things are moving away from them, they're going back to the vanishing point. 2-point perspective is when a box turns towards you where it's got an edge facing towards you. It no longer has a plane facing towards you. It's an edge. What happens then is you still have the central vanishing point. This is where you're looking, but the box, the side of the boxes recede back to 2 vanishing points. That's why it's called 2-point perspective. One on the left and one on the right. Those are diagonal vanishing points. So we still have the central vanishing point, which is where we're looking, and then the boxes are moving away from us towards the diagonal vanishing point. You'll notice that in this case, the horizontals go away, so things don't move straight side to side. They still move straight up and down, and then you have 2 sets of receding lines. The left side of the object recedes to the left, the right side recedes to the right. If this is all getting a little bit confusing, don't worry. Right after this, there will be a video of me drawing through all of this, so you'll be able to see me actually put all of this to work. I just want to get the general vocabulary across in this video, and then you can take a mental break and go watch all of this actually happen in a drawing. A drawing like this, with the top part of it here with the hotel, is constructed, and I know this artist, he did this entirely out of his imagination, and he's using 2-point perspective. There's a lot more rules than what we're going to cover as well, and anything that I don't explain to your liking, you know, I'm more than happy to answer the questions if you get interested in this stuff. I'm just trying to get you a basic overview of it for basic drawing. You can get much more in depth. So this here is an example of something I'd like you to know about it, but we're definitely not going to do it in class. 3-point perspective is when you are looking at the corner of a box. Instead of an edge or a face, you're looking at a corner, and then you have all 3 edges are receding away from you, so you don't have verticals anymore either. This is also like you're standing here with your eye at the horizon line, and then you look up. So you take that central vanishing point up off the horizon line and put it into the sky, or you look down below the horizon line and you put your central vanishing point below the horizon line. The horizon line's still there where your eyes would be if you look straight out, but your attention has moved up or down. And then you still have your 2 diagonal vanishing points. So you can get a drawing like this where you're looking down below where the horizon line is at. That's called a bird's eye view, and that would get you a drawing like this here. You're like up on top of the Empire State Building looking down, going, holy crap, I hope I don't fall. Or you could have a worm's eye view, which is where you shift your attention up off of the horizon line, and you then, like in that case, you would be at the bottom of the Empire State Building looking up going, oh wow, I don't know if I want to take that elevator to the top or not. Again, definitely not going to touch this, but some people are interested in these things, so I would like you to know about it. 5-point curvilinear perspective would be like a globe. So you would have a vanishing point at the pole, both poles and both sides of the equator, and then one in the middle. And you can get like fisheye lens looking things like that. Like you're looking through the little hole in your door and the world's all warped. You could have a 4-point perspective, which gets like a panoramic view. When your cameras are doing panoramic views, there's rules and algorithms built into the camera that's helping it use these mathematical rules of perspective to stitch together all the information it's getting. So that's what's going on here. This stuff is like way more embedded in what we're doing in life than you think, especially in technology. A lot of these rules are in place. Alright, that's the basics of depth cues and linear perspective. The depth cues, hopefully you should, now that you know them, you should just be able to apply them. But we're going to now, I'm going to go through more clearly the rules and procedures of how to make perspective work, and then I'll show you a setup for the assignment that we're going to do, and we'll do a couple assignments using the ideas of linear perspective.